Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of He is Risen, Resurrection Stories. My name is Doug Brower. I'm a coordinator. This is David Brower, no relation.
Different spelling.
Different spelling, that's right. David is a HASP member, and he was born to missionary parents and who raised him in the Belgian Congo. He earned his BA from what is now Cornerstone University. And along the way, he received an MA from Western Michigan University. And then he taught briefly social sciences at the secondary and community college levels. After that, he earned his MDiv from Episcopal Divinity Seminary and served as an Episcopal priest for more than 35 years.
40 now.
Yeah, we'll give you 40. Okay. This is old information. And then most recently, he has served as an interim minister in the Diocese of West Michigan. I learned something yesterday or last week about him. His wife, too, was raised in Africa as the child of missionaries. Looking forward to week 2. Thanks, David.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be back with all of you here, in those of you who are in Zoom land, wherever that Zoom land takes you. So we're going to do a romp, I use that word intentionally, through the Bible. I can remember as growing up as a Baptist kid, you had to have your Bible because the preacher would be going back and forth all over the Bible. And if you didn't have your Bible to look it up, there'd be something wrong with you. So it's not quite that bad. But how many of you have a Bible with you? All right. So when we get to that point, I'm going to invite different ones of you, whoever would like to volunteer, to read the text, because we have several texts that we're going to look at over that period. But before we get into that, I have 2 things I want to deal with. First of all, Mary Heisman, right over there, if you don't know her, you should know her, said to me, "What do you mean by the resurrection?" And I thought that was a great question because we've never really looked at what the term means. So I decided to get out my big annotated, unannotated dictionary. And under the term resurrect is several meanings. The primary one is to raise to life from dead. And then secondary meanings, and I just had a conversation with Ann at the desk. I was talking about the special interest group on racism, and we acknowledged that it sort of died with COVID, and she used the word, maybe we can resurrect it again, because we use that term resurrect not only in terms of bringing people to life from death, but other kinds of meanings. And the similar thing with the term resurrection. One of the nuances in the dictionary about resurrection dealt with spiritual insight. So when a person goes from sort of a non-spiritual or flawed spiritual understanding to a greater understanding, it's a resurrection experience. And I have used that term myself when I've talked with somebody who has had a major shift in their life focus. I've been prone to say, that sounds like a resurrection experience. So it's a broader definition than what we're kind of focusing on. Well, not the first session, but the next several sessions, because they will all focus on resurrection from death to life, and especially the resurrection of Jesus. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I gave you a handout from this book by Norman Perrin. Do any of you not have the handout? Did not get it? No, this is the one about resurrection and myth. And Susan is bringing some copies for those of you. Well, it may have just gone out. I don't know if it. Oh, okay, you do have it. Are you a Luddite like me? So Norman Perrin, the author of this little book, was one of the premier New Testament scholars in the middle of the 20th century, the 1960s, 70s, and wrote several really important books on New Testament scholarship. But this little book, The Resurrection, which he focuses on the three synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, he had this introductory material, which the title of the section which I gave you was Resurrection Narratives as Myth. Now, we talked a bit about myth last time. And for most people who have not wrestled with the understanding of the word myth, we tend to think of myth as untrue. It's certainly been battered around a great deal in our political climate as now. But he goes on to show in this little book that the understanding of myth is much broader than that. And one of the things he does earlier in this chapter is look at myths about our life as Americans. And he focuses particularly on 1776, but then looks at other kind of mythic elements of our identity as Americans. So I just want to pause for a moment and think about, or have you say, what kind of myths have you either lived with that are part of your DNA, or that you have discarded because you don't think they're really true myths? Yes, we're going to get the microphone over here, aren't we? Yeah, you can't sit down for long.
I think my problem is that I think of the word myth meaning not true.
Yeah.
Because if you say something and then somebody says, instead of, oh, that's not true, they'll say, oh, Joan, that's a myth.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a derogatory use of the word myth. And I have to get over that to think of the broader, more respected definition of myth.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. That is in our common everyday usage. That's what we think of as myth, something that's untrue. And our former president was very good at that. But myth, the way he is using it, and he comes down to two things at the end of his little section of his chapter. And I just want to identify them again. He uses myth as a primordial matrix, and then as a foundation myth. In primordial, he's referring to, if we want to take it into this country, the primordial myth, if you wish, is we are the land of the free. Well, there's a lot about untrue about that, but it is a part of our identity as Americans. And then he also uses it as a foundational, which might be even closer to that than the other. So any other comments that you want to make about myth?
Yes, David, I found this excerpt just very fascinating. I really thought it was great, but I wish there could be another word for myth in the context that we see here, that there are so many Christians who believe in every word of the Bible, that if the word myth, as Joan said, if the word myth comes up, all kinds of bells and whistles go off. I remember a couple years ago, we had a class, I think Judy was teaching it, where we were talking about feminist aspects of the Bible. And partway through, one gentleman jumped up and said, I thought this was Bible study. Every word in the Bible is true, so this isn't what I expected. And he left.
He
So-
packed up his books and went.
So I just think, I love the concept, but the word in this room, we can kind of grasp it, but there are many out there who immediately would say untruth and ignore it.
Yeah, I'm not skilled enough to think about an alternative word that would be widely accepted and would carry the same sort of nuance that he does with using of myth. I think it's part of an educational thing. We have to re-educate people about words that we use because we think everybody understands what we mean when maybe they don't.
This brings me to mind what I encountered today. Today is the day my mother passed away.
Mhm.
And we have a family thing where we communicate back and forth, and that was done today. And the brother I have that's a year younger than me, he says, well, I was always the one that gave mom the most trouble. But I was thinking of something I remember about him, and legend or myth. And I put that in the thing. I said, well, I remember a story about this, my mother glancing out the window and seeing this little blonde head popping around the house as in the part of the day, and found out it was my brother who didn't want to go to school, wanted to stay home with mom. So was that a myth or was that a legend? Found out it was the truth, so.
Yeah, that's an interesting sort of nuance about using the term legend instead of myth. And I'm not quite sure how to wrap my mind around that because most of the biblical scholarship that I read talks about, and using this broader definition of myth that Norman Perrin and others people do, use of the word myth as a idea about it. I think that what my quick reaction to that is that if it's mythic, it's story that has been passed on. And maybe in your family, that was a story that was passed on, but it's certainly not a written story, or it's not a common story. Whereas I think myth has a broader acceptance of the story as being story. And then the cutting edges, is it mythic or is it actual history? So I think that's kind of the way I understand how Norman Perrin is using the word myth. Any other comments about myth?
Years ago, I struggled with this, and I was reading an article by a Christian educator, and she quoted a line, she said a line which I have lived by forever. She said, "The story you are about to hear may never have happened, but the story you are about to hear is true." And it was like the light bulb went on. I mean, I didn't have to look at the Bible as necessarily being literally true, but it's true.
And that's kind of the sense, if you're familiar with Marcus Borg, a much more recent New Testament scholar. He says the Bible is true, but it may not be literally true. So he didn't say it's true as myth, but it is true because it carries a great deal of weight for our religious experience, but it's not necessarily literally true. And I think that's kind of where we get caught up often in struggling with myth. We're used to, those of us who grew up in the more evangelical churches, that the Bible is literally true. Everything in the Bible is literally true. And if you call it myth, then there's something wrong with you. All right, anything else on myth before we plunge in? I thought his little, particularly the quotation of Amos Wilder's, that little paragraph where he looks at the different types of mythic journeys. I thought that was really very interesting. And it would be on page 12 of that book. And it's inserted because it's a quote. And he focuses particularly on 3 and 4 as the two definitions of myth that convey what he's trying to do with the resurrection stories. Okay. Anything more on myth? Yes.
There's a program on TV called Truth or Fiction or something like that. And it tells all about, this is how we were taught, or this is how we think today everything happened. And then he'll say fact or fiction, and then it'll turn out that it was probably fiction, because he will then explain exactly what really happened. So as you were talking earlier, there are myths in the United States that have grown up and that has covered over what the real stories are. So sometimes when we say something that we thought we had learned in college or whatever, and then a program like this says, no, that's not really true. Here's the real story. Maybe that's the name of the program, The Real Story. But it acknowledges that this is going on, that those are myths quite often.
Yeah, and I think another nuance of that, I get Time Magazine, which I find really a useful part of my journey through what's going on in the world. And the article that I found really fascinating was Lithuania, which is one of the Soviet republics, now free, have been combating the disinformation that is coming out of the Soviet Union or out of Russia. And that's a major part of their work, which is in terms of anything, disinformation. We have experienced a lot of it even in our own country. It's not myth because it doesn't carry on the long-term thing, but it certainly is similar to false information. Okay, let's plunge into the Bible. So the first text, which is a very short little thing, is from Genesis 5, 22 and 24. Genesis right at the beginning of the Bible, by the way. And you might not think of this as a resurrection story, but it does carry a correlation with a much larger similar story later on. Anybody have that? Put your hand up and you'll get the mic. Huh? Genesis 5, 22 through 24.
And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him.
That's the key phrase, God took him. So Enoch, like later when we get to the Elijah story, didn't die. So if we're looking at death and resurrection, well, there's no resurrection because he didn't die. Anyway, that's very mythic part of the Old Testament. All right, so the next text I would like us to look at is 1 Samuel 28, 7 through 19. Seven through 19. This is a story about when Saul was the king of the early part of the monarchy and running into great trouble with the Philistines. And by the way, the Philistines are probably the modern day, because they were on the coast, so it would be like modern day, not Syria, but the other, what's the other country? Lebanon, yeah. All right, somebody want to read that?
There is such a medium in Endor, his servants replied. So Saul disguised himself, dressing in different clothes. Then he and 2 men set out, going to the woman at nighttime.
And he said, consult a spirit for me and bring up for me the one whom I name to you. The woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done, how he was cut off from the mediums and the wizards from the land. Why then are you laying a snare for my life to bring about my death? But swore Saul to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? He answered, bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. The king said to her, have no fear. What do you see? The woman said to Saul, I see a divine being come up out of the ground. He said to her, what is his appearance? She said, an old man is coming up. He is wrapped in a robe. So Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did obeisance.
That's probably good enough. Yeah. So this is not quite death and new life, except that, according to this story, Samuel still was around in the underworld and could be brought up by a medium. And the Old Testament didn't take kindly to mediums, but it's a little nuance to the fluidity, if you wish, of death, because when you hear stories of near-death experiences, well, it's not as final as what we want to think of it. So there's that story. Then the next one, and this is closer to where we're at, 1 Kings 17, 17 through 24. First Kings 17, 17 through 24. Somebody want to read that?
And this is from the Message. Later on, the woman's son became sick. The sickness took a turn for the worst, and then he stopped breathing. The woman said to Elijah, "Why did you ever show up here in the first place? A holy man barging in and exposing my sins and killing my son." And Elijah said, "Hand me your son." He then took him from her bosom, carried him up to the loft where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he prayed, "Oh God, my God, why have you brought this terrible thing on this widow who has opened her home to me? Why have you killed her son?" 3 times he stretched himself out the full length on the boy, praying with all his might, "God, my God, put breath back into his body." God listened to Elijah's prayer and put breath back into his body. He was alive. Elijah picked the boy up, carried him downstairs from the loft, and gave him to his mother. "Here is your son," said Elijah, "alive." And the woman said to Elijah, "I see it all now. You are a holy man. When you speak, God speaks a true word."
Okay, so that's really, if you wish, in the journey of the Bible, it's the first record of an actual resurrection experience. Now, we who are imbued with modern technology and modern awareness, we might want to say he just did resuscitation, because he laid on the body of the little boy. But, at least according to the biblical story, it was a resurrection. Okay, we got a comment over here.
I couldn't follow it at all because she was hard to understand.
Okay,
And I couldn't find where were we in Kings?
we're 1 Kings 17 through 24. And the backstory of this is, remember, Elijah had this combat with the prophets of Baal and he won that contest. And then Jezebel said, "Before the sun goes down, I'm going to get you." And he runs. And then he's told by God to go to Zarephath, which is on the coast. And there's a woman there who will provide for you. So he does that. And then this is where this story comes in, because she has a son and the son dies. Okay? So that's the first kind of, if you wish, a real resurrection story in the biblical story. So the next one, I just want us to read it because it connects with the Enoch story at the very beginning. 2 Kings 2:9 through 12. And you'll remember this story, I'm sure. 2 Kings 2:9 through 12. Anybody want to read it?
When they had crossed over, Elijah said to Elisha, "Request whatever I might do for you before I am taken from you." Elisha answered, "May I receive a double portion of your spirit." He replied, "You have asked something that is not easy. Still, if you see me taken up from you, your wish will be granted, otherwise not." As they walked on, still conversing, a fiery chariot and fiery horses came between the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind, and Elisha saw it happen. He cried out, my father, Israel's chariot and steeds." Then he saw him no longer.
So if you're, remember the Enoch story, here is the second story, if you wish, in the biblical corpus of somebody who didn't die. Well, maybe we'll get to the same thing when we finally get to Lazarus, because we don't know what happened to Lazarus after he was resurrected. But this story, and do any of you remember the movie called Chariots of Fire? It was a great movie, and it was based on, I mean, the title was based on this story. It was a great story. All right, so next we come to another real resurrection story. Now remember, in the Old Testament, the two prophetic figures, before we get the prophets that have written material, is Elijah and Elisha. And we have the story about the transfer of power from Elijah to Elisha. So this next story focuses on Elisha. So it's just a couple chapters later, chapter 4, 11 through 37 of Elisha. And a lot of times in Hebrew, there's these different names that get sort of similar. It's just part of the Hebrew way of telling stories. Elisha and Elijah could have been the same person, but they get distinguished in these stories. So somebody want to read that? It's a little longer story.
Okay, on the day when he came there, he went up to the chamber and lay there. And he said to his servant Gazi, call the Shunammite woman. When he had called her, she stood before him. He said to him, say to her, since you have taken all this trouble for us, what may be done for you? Would you have a word spoken on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army? She answered, I live among my own people. He said, what then may be done for her? Gehazi answered, well, she has no son and her husband is old. He said, call her. When he had called her, she stood at the door. He said, at this season in due time, you shall embrace a son. She replied, no, my lord, O man of God, do not deceive your servant. The woman conceived and bore a son at that season in due time, as Elisha had declared to her. When a child was older, he went out one day to his father among the reapers. He complained to his father, oh, my head, my head. The father said to his servant, carry him to his mother. He carried him and brought him to his mother. The child sat on her lap until noon, and he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, closed the door on him, and left. Then she called to her husband and said, send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, so that I may quickly go to the man of God and come back again. He said, why go to him today? It is neither the new moon nor Sabbath. She said, it will be all right. Then she saddled the donkey and said to her servant, urge the animal on, do not hold back for me unless I tell you. So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi, his servant, look, there's the Shunammite woman. Run at once to meet her and say to her, are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is the child all right? She answered, it is all right. When she came to the man of God at the mountain, she caught hold of his feet. Gehazi approached to push her away, but the man of God said, let her alone, for she is in bitter distress. The Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. Then she said, did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, do not mislead me? He said to Gehazi, gird up your loins and take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, give no greeting. And if anyone greets you, do not answer, and lay my staff on the face of the child. Then the mother of the child said, as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave without you. So he rose up and followed her. Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was no sound or life in him. He came back to meet him and told him, the child has not awakened. When Elisha came into the house, he saw the child lying dead on his bed. So he went in and closed the door on the two of them and prayed to the Lord. Then he got up on the bed and lay upon the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And while he lay bent over him, the flesh of the child became warm. He got down, walked once to and fro in the room, then got up again and bent over him. The child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Elisha summoned Gehazi and said, call the Shunammite woman. So he called her. When she came to him, he said, take your son.
Isn't that a beautiful story? How many of you have heard that before? It's a wonderful second story, if you wish, from the Old Testament about a resurrection. And again, you know, with modern medicine, you might say, well, this is no true resurrection because all it was resuscitation. But in that day, they didn't know such a thing. So it was recorded as a, and what is interesting in this particular story is 2 things, 2, if you wish, miraculous things. One is the boy being resurrected to life, and 2, the woman who's old has a baby. And we know that story gets told fairly often in the Old Testament. Think of Sarah and various other women who were beyond the age of bearing children, and they do. All right, so we're almost done with the Old Testament, except one more great story. Which one would you think that is? What's a resurrection story in the Old Testament that is just marvelous? You've heard it. Ezekiel 37. Now, admittedly, this is a dream or a vision, but it certainly is about as vivid a resurrection story as you can have. So Ezekiel 37, 1 through 14. And I'm sure you've heard this at least at the Easter Vigil, if not at other times during the liturgical year. The bone story. Yes, you can think of a wonderful song that goes with it. Somebody want to read about the dry bones? Okay, good old Joni. She likes to read. She's a teacher after all.
Right, I missed that teacher. It was 1 through what?
1 through 14.
Okay. The Lord's power overcame me, and while I was in the Lord's Spirit, he led me out and set me down in the middle of a certain valley. It was full of bones. He led me through them all around, and I saw that there were a great many of them on the valley floor, and they were very dry. He asked me, human one, can these bones live again? I said, Lord God, only you know. He said to me, prophesy over these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the Lord's word. The Lord God proclaims to these bones, I am about to put breath in you and you will live again. I will put sinews on you, place flesh on you and cover you with skin. When I put breath in you and you come to life, you will know that I am the Lord. I prophesied just as I was commanded. There was a great noise as I was prophesying. Then a great quaking, and the bones came together, bone by bone. When I looked, suddenly there were sinews on them. The flesh appeared, and then they were covered over with skin, but there was still no breath in them. He said to me, prophesy to the breath, prophesy, human one. Say to the breath, the Lord God proclaims, come forth from the four winds, breath. Breathe into these dead bodies and let them live. I prophesied just as he commanded me. When the breath entered them, they came to life and stood on their feet, an extraordinarily large company. He said to me, human one, these bones are the entire house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope has perished. We are completely finished. So now prophesy and say to them, the Lord God proclaims, I'm opening your graves. I will raise you up from your graves, my people, and I will bring you to Israel's fertile land. You will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and raise you up from your graves. My people, I will put my breath in you and you will live. I will plant you on your fertile land and you will know that I am the Lord. I've spoken and I will do it. This is what the Lord says.
Wow. So just keep in mind, Ezekiel did not see this. It was a vision. It was not a real happening of a valley full of bones. Because in the book of Ezekiel, there's a lot of visioning kind of material. And so, and you find it in other prophetic material, but particularly in the book of Ezekiel. He was a mystic, if you wish. And so he had these mystical visionary experiences. But the other thing about that particular reading was the very end of it, where God says, I will open up your graves and the dead will come forth. So there's a general nuance of resurrection. Even in that story, it comes more pronounced as we go further into the New Testament. But the image of getting raised up from your grave is a pretty common image in the biblical story. So that's the journey through the Old Testament. Anything more you want to say about the Old Testament? Anything that you found that I missed? Yes.
Well, I was thinking of it a different way. Oh, sorry. I was thinking of it a different way last week when you said, what are you thinking of? And I was thinking of the story of Jonah and the whale,
Mhm.
because he was, you know, they didn't say he was dead exactly, but I mean, being in a whale would kind of, you know, do that.
Especially if you were chomped up.
But the fact that he was supposed, you know, in the story, he's in there for 3 days and then the whale, I don't know, spits him out. So I thought of that like Jesus in the tomb for 3 days and then came out.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because there's again that 3-day image, which reoccurs quite often in the biblical story, about 3 days. So you could think of the prophet Jonah as being dead for 3 days. If you're in a belly of a whale, you'd be dead. Although he prayed and God delivered him. So yeah, I think that's a good correlation. Did we have another one?
I was thinking the same thing, David, and the prayer of Jonah when he's in the whale
Uh-huh.
is filled with that image. He goes down to the where he's wrapped around with weeds and the light's gone forever and nobody ever comes back. You know, I mean, it reads almost like some of the mythologies we looked at last week of people descending into the underworld
Yeah,
and then
that's
coming
great.
back. So there's loads of imagery in there.
Well, next time I do this, I'll have to add that one. That's a great addition to the Old Testament. All right, let's jump to the New Testament. And before we get to the Gospels, the first text that we want to look at is Acts 9, 1 through 9. I remember when I was in Bible college days, we had this little, or maybe it was even in high school, we had this little thing called a sword drill. Any of you ever have that experience? The Bible is the sword of the Lord, and you would hold your Bible up like this, and then whoever was leading it would read off a text like Habakkuk 2:4. And whoever could find it first, they'd stand up and read it. So we'd learn how to go through the Bible. All right, somebody want to read that? 9, 1 through 9.
But Paul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he would bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he journeyed, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed about him. And he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Paul arose from the ground, and when his eyes opened, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank.
So this is, you all know, Luke, Acts is the same author. Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and then Acts was the follow-up of the early church. So it's Luke, Acts version of this event that happened to Paul. Remember that the time and events of Paul's life was in the 50s. So this is written sometime in the 80s. So it's at least 30 years after Paul's life, but it's Luke's version of the story. And then you'll have later, and I'm not going to have us go there, but in chapter 22 of Acts and chapter 26, Paul again tells the story when he's before different tribunals. So it was a pivotal story in the life of Paul. In fact, we refer to it as the conversion of Paul. In fact, in the annual cycle of the church year, the conversion of Paul and the confession of Peter are the two endpoints of the week of Christian unity, which we don't honor very much anymore like we once did. But there's a question about, and among biblical scholars, is this a conversion experience or is it a calling experience? So to just get a flavor of that nuance, if you want to go back into the Old Testament to Isaiah chapter 6, 1 through 9, this is the story of Isaiah's calling. And as you hear that, you'll think, maybe that's not much different then what happened to Paul. And there are other calling stories in the Old Testament. There's one in Jeremiah, there's one in Ezekiel. All similarly have encounters that are beyond ordinary. So somebody want to find that and read it. Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 9.
In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the thresholds shook at the voice of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed, and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. And he said, Go and say to this people.
Okay, we don't need the rest of that because that's the bad part of the story. So this, of course, is a visionary experience of Isaiah. I remember reading some commentaries who would try to correlate to the temple, and it doesn't fit. It's a visionary experience very similar to Ezekiel's visionary experience of the Valley of Dry Bones. But we might think of the encounter that Paul had would be visionary. Because one of the clues to that was the people who were with him, he fell down on the ground because he saw this bright light and heard the voice. And it did say in that text that they saw the bright light, but they did not hear the voice. So there's a visionary element in that story. And certainly from that point on, Paul felt called to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. It was his calling experience as much as it was for Isaiah. So, next time you hear about the conversion of Paul, you might think, oh, well, maybe. Yeah, because those are all kind of visionary experiences. Certainly Moses and the burning bush. People have tried to make literal events out of that, but it was a mystical experience. And we modern day people don't quite know how to deal with mystical experiences because they're beyond the ordinary. And certainly the wrestling of Jacob with the angel, that was a mystical encounter for Jacob, this scoundrel who sort of turned his life around, sort of, maybe.
And yet when he woke up, as it were, he had a broken hip or a injured hip.
Yes.
So there was something
There was
that
something
went
that
on.
happens. Well, and which is true if you listen to the stories of people with mystical encounters with God. often it's not just something in their head, there's something else that happens in their experience. So, I mean, we tend to want to separate out our body selves from our spiritual selves, but they're really much more integrated and correlated than what we tend to think of, particularly in terms of modern science. Okay, so that's the text of Luke Acts about this encounter. Now, the next one I want us to do is Paul's own version of this, which is in 1 Corinthians 15. First Corinthians 15, 3 through 9. Anybody want to read that? This reminds me of being back in grade school when you think, oh, I hope the teacher doesn't call on me to read.
Okay, 15, 3 through 9. I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then of the 12. And after that, he was seen of above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remained unto this present, but some are fallen asleep. After that, he was seen of James, then of all of the apostles. For I am the least of the apostles, that am not meet to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God.
So it's that last phrase, Paul puts himself in that story of the resurrection appearances, which, by the way, this is the first written account of the resurrection appearances. The Gospels happen some at least 20, 30, 40 years after this. So this is the first written account of the resurrection appearances. But Paul at the very end says, last of all, he appeared to me. So he's putting himself in terms of his visionary experiences on the road to Damascus in the same group as the other witnesses, a point which we will come to later when we deal with the gospel stories, because it deals with resurrection appearances as, if you wish, mystical experiences, or in the terms of Perrin, mythical experiences. So that's the thing I wanted you to look at. Any comments about any of that so far? Yes.
You know, back at the beginning, when you were talking about, the definition of resurrection and how maybe it was more, you could use it in another way, and kind of like, we might say an aha experience, something like that. Well, during the crucifixion, when the Roman soldier, the centurion, drove his.
She was not a woman.
Pardon?
The centurion was not a woman.
No, I didn't say
Yeah.
a woman.
Oh,
I was
sorry.
trying to think, I was thinking soldier, but anyways,
right, yeah.
centurion,
Uh-huh.
thrust his lance into Jesus and the water came out, and he said something to the effect of, like, oh my gosh, this truly was the Son of God.
Right.
And apparently he was not a Jew, he was a Roman. And so for him, that was kind of he resurrected from being a non-believer to a believer, you might say.
Mhm.
I don't know. I just, your definition at the beginning of this class kind of made me think, oh, that,
Yeah, and you could refer to that almost as a resurrection experiences because it was a pivotal experience for him, as well as the stories about the crucifixion of Jesus, the acknowledgement of the centurion that truly this is the Son of God. It's in the Gospel of Mark, it's the only reference by a person that truly this was the Son of God. So it is foundational. All right.
Just a comment, you mentioned we looked at the Paul's account in 1 Corinthians 15. And in 2 Corinthians 12, he himself talks about being caught up into the third heaven.
Yeah, right.
And has a vision very much, it sounds very much like Isaiah. He sees
Mhm.
things that no human being can see and hears things
Mhm.
nobody can hear. So it seems very similar to what was happening in Isaiah.
That's a very good point because Paul was not adverse to dealing with, even though we don't think of Paul as a very mystical kind of writer, preacher, but he acknowledged his own correlation with that. That's great. All right, so going back to earlier in the Bible, the first, and not the only one, but the first story of a resurrection during Jesus' time is the story of the raising of Jairus's daughter. So we'll look at it. It's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke because they all follow the same story. Let's use Matthew's version. Matthew 5:18 through 26. It's also in Luke 8 and in Mark 5. Matthew 5:18 through 26.
I say to you very seriously that as long as heaven and
No, I think I got the wrong one there, sorry. So let's switch to look at Mark 5. I wrote down the wrong number. Mark 5:21 through 24, and then 35 through 42. You could read the whole thing, but there's two different stories that are embedded with each other.
so what do you want me to do?
Mark 5:21.
Okay. How far?
Well, read 21 through 24, and then you can skip about the woman.
I'll stop and
Yeah.
then I'll say now where do you
We'll
want
pick
this?
it up with
Yeah.
35.
Jesus crossed the lake again, and on the other side, a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Jairus, one of the synagogue leaders, came forward. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded with him, "My daughter is about to die. Please come and place your hands on her so that she can be healed and live." So Jesus went with him.
Okay, so Mark has a tendency, but it gets copied in the other two gospels, of doing one story embedded in another story. So the story we're going to skip is the story of the woman with the bleeding issue who comes and touches the hem of his garment. And Jesus has an encounter with her and whatever. But then the story of Jairus picks up again in verse 35.
Okay. To the end
Yeah.
While Jesus was still speaking with her, messengers came from the synagogue leader's house saying to Jairus, "Your daughter has died. Why bother the teacher any longer?" But Jesus overheard their report and said to the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid, just keep trusting." He didn't allow anyone to follow him except Peter, James, and John, James' brother. They came to the synagogue leader's house, and he saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "What's all this commotion and crying about? The child isn't dead, she's only sleeping." They laughed at him, but he threw them all out. Then, taking the child's parents and his disciples with him, he went to the room where the child was. Taking her hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Young woman, get up." Suddenly, the young woman got up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. They were shocked. He gave them strict orders that no one should know what had happened. Then he told them to give her something to eat.
So that's a story of Jesus and the raising of somebody. We won't get back to Jesus raising somebody until we get to the Lazarus story. But that story, and I misquoted the Matthew text, it's Matthew 9, where this same story appears, and it's also in Luke chapter 8. So it's the synoptics, Mark was the first gospel to write, and his stories are often copied in different, somewhat slightly different versions, but very similar in Matthew and Luke. And so certain stories like this story gets repeated by all three gospels. All right, so that's the that story. Now I want to have another one that's a little bit different, but there's a nuance here that I think will be worth hearing. Mark chapter 1, 29 through 31. This is right at the very beginning of Jesus' life in Mark's story. Somebody else want to read that? Joni's getting tired of reading. Okay, verse 29 through 31.
And forthwith, when they were come out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. But Simon's wife's mother lay sick of a fever, and anon they tell him of her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her, and she ministered unto them. And at even when the
Okay,
sun.
that's
Oh,
good.
that's enough.
So it's that English there that lifted her up. In the Greek, it's the same word for resurrection. So here is Mark early in his story using that term resurrect that comes later at the very end of the gospel. So we will find out that Mark doesn't seem to pay much attention to resurrection stories, but it's laced in throughout the gospel, these little nuances. So I wanted you to just hear that. Then let's go to Mark chapter 6, 14 through 16. And this is a story about John the Baptist. There's a more elaborate story of it in Luke, where Herod takes the wife of his brother as his wife, and the apostles are not very happy with that, and they condemn him. And then here's the story that Herod says. Mark chapter 6, 14 through 16.
King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some said, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead. That is why these powers are at work in him. But others said, it is Elijah. And others said, it is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised.
So that's the key, is that in New Testament times, the idea of somebody being raised from the dead was not as foreign or incomprehensible as it may seem in our own day. And so Herod, who at least as the story goes, didn't want to behead John because he was kind of fond of him, when he heard about Jesus, would easily make that comment that John has come back to life, because John, before Jesus, was acknowledged as a holy man and as a powerful holy man. All right, so now I want to give you just one short little reading. Oh, wait a minute, let me see. No, we have some more coming. So let's go first to okay, it's a cute little story. It's in Acts 20, 9 through 12. And I don't think you've ever heard this story in a lectionary reading on Sunday morning. You may not even know the story. So Acts 20, 9 through 12. Mary knows the story. So let Mary read it.
The other Mary.
A young man named Eutychus, who was sitting in the window, began to sink off into a deep sleep while Paul talked still longer. Overcome by sleep, he fell to the ground 3 floors below and was picked up dead. But Paul went down and, bending over him, took him in his arms and said to him, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." Then Paul went upstairs, and after he had broken bread and eaten, he continued to converse with them until dawn. Then he left. Meanwhile, they had taken the little boy away alive and were not a little comforted. The word of the Lord.
So that's the story. A short little story. There's nothing, it doesn't say anything that Paul did to this little boy other than to say he's not dead. So maybe the punchline of that is beware of somebody who preaches long sermons. So next, because we do have to read this one, John 11, 1 through 43. This is the story of Lazarus, and it's a long story, but it's a good story. Because, by the way, in the Gospel of the Synoptics, the key event that gets the power structure to want to kill Jesus is the cleansing of, so-called cleansing of the temple in Holy Week. That's what gets everything going. In the Gospel of John, there's no such event listed. So it is the raising of Lazarus that gets the power structure activated, because they can't have this guy going around raising people from the dead. So Somebody have that text, chapter 11, 1 through 43. It's a long story. Okay, you want to start?
I'll let you pass the microphone.
It's sort of in my Bible, paragraph.
That's fine. You read a paragraph and they'll pick it up.
So I'm going to read through 16. A certain man, Lazarus, was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This was the Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent word to Jesus saying, Lord, the one whom you love is ill. When he heard this, Jesus said, this illness isn't fatal. It's for the glory of God, so that God's Son can be glorified through it. Boy, if somebody said that to me, about my family. Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. When he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was. After 2 days, he said to his disciples, let's return to Judah again. The disciples replied, Rabbi, the Jewish opposition wants to stone you, but you want to go back? Jesus answered, aren't there 12 hours in the day? Whoever walks in the day doesn't stumble because they see the light of the world. But whoever walks in the night does stumble because the light isn't in them. He continued, our friend Lazarus is sleeping, but I am going in order to wake him up. The disciples said, Lord, if he's sleeping, he will get well. They thought Jesus meant that Lazarus was in a deep sleep, but Jesus had spoken about Lazarus's death. Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. For your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there so that you can believe. Now let's go to him. Then Thomas, the one called Didymus, said to the other disciples, let's go too, so that we may die with Jesus.
All right, next.
When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world.
When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying quietly, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary quickly rise and go out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to weep there. Then Mary, when she came where Jesus was and saw him, fell down at his feet, saying, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? And they said, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who have opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?"
Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laying across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he had been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you would always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go."
Preachers love this story because that very ending of it, unbind him and let him go free. They can go on about how do we bind up people with whatever we do and not let them go free. Well, I'm not going there, but I just wanted to add that little nuance. So this story of Lazarus, which appears only, of course, in the Gospel of John, was a pivotal story for John in terms of Jesus and the crucifixion. So we have one more story of a resurrection. And then I just we're not going to read them, but there's several sermons in the New Testament where the image, the theology of the resurrection is prominent. Peter's sermon on the resurrection right after the Pentecost event, you know, when Peter is preaching, he references the resurrection quite a bit. And then Paul in chapter 6 of Romans gets on his platform and talks about the resurrection. And then we have Peter's story on the resurrection. No, I already mentioned that, Peter 2:14. So those are the two major sermons. And then, of course, what we have not done is in the last book of the Bible, Revelation, the very ending of the book is a resurrection kind of event. So, but I want us to look at Dorcas, Acts chapter 9, 36 through 42. And this is Peter.
(36 to 42).
Yes.
Now there was at Joppa a certain disciple named Tabitha, which by interpretation is called Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and alms deeds, which she did. And it came to pass in those days that she was sick and died, whom when they had washed, they laid her in an upper chamber. And forasmuch as Lydda was nigh to Joppa, and the disciples had heard that Peter was there, they sent unto him 2 men, desiring him that he would not delay to come to them. Then Peter rose and went to them. When he was come, they brought him in the upper chamber, and all the widows stood by him, weeping and shewing the coats and garments which Dorcas made while she was with them. But Peter put them all forth and knelt down and prayed, and turning him to the body said, "Tabitha, rise." And he opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and lifted her up. And when he had called the saints and widows, presented her alive. And it was known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And it came to pass that he tarried many days in Joppa with
Okay,
one Simon the tanner.
that's enough. Thank you. So that's the story of Peter as a resurrector power. So that's the end of the stories that I know of, other than the sermons and the book of Revelation. And we're almost done with our time. Anybody, any other stories that you can remember that you think should have been put into the list? John Buttery told me he was not going to be able to be here because he had to do something for his wife, but he said, I have all the stories.
I
So-
don't have any questions in chat, but I'm wondering if somebody at home would like to unmute themselves and be able to interact.
Okay, sure.
So if you are at home and want to participate, just unmute yourself. And if we don't hear anything, then we'll move on.
Well, thank you all for being part of this adventure. Next week, we're going to deal with the first resurrection story, which is Mark, being the first gospel written. And then we're going to deal with the last one, which is the Gospel of John. And then we'll do Matthew and Luke in the last session. So, and similar to today, we're going to read through the stories of the resurrection according to the two Gospels, and then make some commentary about those stories. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, David. We'll see everybody next week. And with that, I will close the class. Have a great week.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Douglas.